So welcome Dave Snowden and Beth Smith. So we are going to discuss the topic sensemaking in complexity. Would you first like to tell us a bit about yourselves?
Sure. My name's Beth. I'm local. I'm the resident Welsh person here. And I work for the Cynefin Company. And hopefully we'll go into a bit more depth later. But my particular interest is in democracy and shared decision makings. And how do we include lots of different people's voices within decisions in a way that is much more just than what we're used to doing typically?
Dave Snowden, I created the Cynefin Company almost 2 decades ago. My ancestry is a little mixture of South Wales and North Wales, so I grew up in the north. But my mother took me back to Cardiff every holiday, so I wouldn't think of myself as North Walian, but we're tribal here, right? I think my passion is engagement, I think similar to Beth's on that. But I think we've got to change the way we govern interactions at a much more hyper-local level if we're going to survive as a species. And that for me is important.
Yeah, thank you. So your work sits at the intersection of complexity and sense-making. So could you speak about the idea of collective sense-making and also why it is important for the youth trying to navigate in this increasingly complex world?
All right, I'll start and then Beth can correct me, right? I think we define sense-making as how do you make sense of the world so you can act in it. And with that comes a key concept of sufficiency. You never know everything you need to know in order to act. So there's this high level of contingency. I think the other thing which comes into this is we really need to start journeys with a sense of direction rather than have very specific goals. I think a lot of what has gone wrong with the climate change movement is to over-focus on goals rather than getting people started. And so a lot of our work is on that. So we've experimented with things, for example, like transgenerational pairs. So putting teenagers together with people from their grandparents' generation. And there are cognitive science reasons to do that. Putting them in trios with people from government. So starting to create much more distributed methods of decision making. There's a non-idealistic in nature, and I think that's key. We've got to be really pragmatic these days, not idealistic.
No, I think for me, the whole idea of complexity is what we call the domain of the unknown unknowns. So there's things that are happening that we literally don't have these things on our mental map, so we don't even realize that we don't know them. But luckily we're humans and we're a whole distributed, diverse network, and somebody else, there's a very good chance that somebody else does know these things. And it's about how do we actually work together as a collective in order to use and harvest and include different points of view, different ways of knowing what's going on in the world in a way that is much more generative.
There's 2 bits of science which I think are relevant there. One is physics only accounts for 5% of the known universe. So there's a lot we don't even know about, whether it's dark matter or dark energy. And then there's a famous experiments by which if you give radiologists X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final X-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists do not see it. And the 17% who do come to believe they were wrong. And that's one of the areas I get hope. I think it means there's a huge amount out there, and it's also the actual unknown knowns. Some of the work Beth and I have been doing with indigenous communities in Australia, for example, there are things which are known at that level, but are unknown at a more international level. So I think all of that starts to come together. There's a huge amount there to be discovered if we just look for it differently.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so you talked briefly about climate change, and I think that's a really that's a very relevant issue, especially in me and Aava's generation, with a lot of the youth leading this sort of campaign to try to find solutions for this climate emergency. So in the contemporary world, there are many issues, and this deeply concerns the youth. You've created a technological tool called the Sensemaker. Can you explain what it is, how this tool could be used to help the youth make sense of all of this? Or do you have any examples of how this tool has been used, or how it's been used by powerful institutions?
You're definitely
I'll take that one. So ultimately, Sensemaker is about how do we actually open up our eyes to these unknown unknowns. And by starting off with usually a narrative or a story from people's experiences and observations, we would do that across a whole network of people. And then the difference is with Sensemaker, rather than then using an AI to interpret what we found out, because AIs tend to come with pre-inherited biases based upon who's programmed the AI and the training data that it's used. So what we're saying is actually the person that shares that story most validly and most intimately knows that story and what it means, because they're in the place in which it happened. So we encourage the person who shared that story to self-interpret their own story against a set of quantitative metrics. And then our system basically works to combine all of those things into a common kind of map, so that we can start to see, well, this is the dominant point of view, this is what most people seem to see the world like, but actually there's some people who are seeing things a bit differently here, and we can start to understand the stories and the context that actually shape that. So it gives us a way of doing kind of story and narrative research at the scale of quantitative research as typically happened. And there's one really key point here, what we call epistemic justice. And the idea of epistemic injustice is that our society privileges certain ways of knowing over others, or certain people as knowing things in comparison to other people. And our society has inherited these things. They're there, and sometimes we don't even know they're there. So that the quote I would always say is that, why do we always call old wives' tales, but we call old men's tales philosophy and religion? And these are things that we've just taken for granted. These are literally the water we swim in. And it's actually, how can we actually start to make these something visible, so that we can start questioning them, doing things about it, and actually using the knowledge resources that in the past we've discredited, because there's a fair chance that there was actually something really powerful there, and to not kind of be too kind of single-minded in the way we approach the world.
I think there's some related work here. So, for example, we know that the only way we're going to do something about climate change is to achieve a very high degree of sacrifice. A good friend and former colleague of mine, Terry Eagleton, wrote a brilliant book on this called Radical Sacrifice. The trouble is, you're not going to get sacrificed at a national or international level till people learn to make sacrifices at a local level. So one of the things we've been looking at is, how do we capture those stories, and how do we propagate those stories so people can see the examples? And one of the big visions we got, which we've already done experimentally, but we would like to make international, is to have every school on the planet, with every 16 to 18-year-old acting as an ethnographer to their own environment. So we can see those micro patterns across multiple cultures, and people can literally connect ideas horizontally without everything going through an agency. Yeah? And I think that's really important, because until you get the small changes going, you don't change the attitudes of people to the point where politicians will respond. I mean, at the moment, the minute you've got an international convention, everybody says, well, it's their problem. Yet we need to make it a local problem before it can become an international problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like with this tool, like, would you say that like it's sort of in the intersection of like objectivity versus subjectivity? Because you mentioned cultures, and like I was just curious about how that like fits into like this sort of sense making.
Okay, I'll go first, then Beth. We probably have differences on this. My background is physics and philosophy, right? So I have a physicist's despair of social science, because they never have enough data to form any conclusion. And I am an old man who's a philosopher, so I've got to be careful because of the privilege that conveys, all right? But I think the thing you're starting to try and look at is to change the balance of the way that we perceive the world, I think, is probably the way to do it. So I want to find the 17% who are seeing things differently. I know I won't find them if I look for them. So one of the things the software does is to present anomalies and common patterns back to people, so that they can say, there's something going on which is different. I need to go and look at that. And this may not be fully answering the question, in which case answer it again. But it's that ability to see anomalies and outliers, which I think is key, and then to find the ones which you can magnify and the ones that you shouldn't. But I don't think it's objective and subjective. I think there's a huge amount of dualism in common thinking. You know, mind-body dualism, you know, all the sort of subconscious, conscious stuff, subjective, objective. If you take a modern scientific perspective on that, that's all a sort of 19th century notion, and we moved on from it. You know, if you look at neo-materialist philosophy, example, we now know the way that human attitudes create material reality. So we don't need those dichotomies. We need a much more coherent view of the whole.
Right. But like when you're talking about anomalies versus like normal, sorry, what was the word you using? Like anomalies, outliers. Like how would you classify that? Because like you said, we all have very different opinions, and I was just wondering how this would how does Sensemaker map this out, and what are anomalies?
So we measure coherence, all right? Now, coherence is an important word in philosophy of science. So we know, for example, evolutionary theory is largely wrong because we keep discovering new things. You know, epigenetics, for example. But at any one time, we know that what we're saying is coherent to the facts. Whereas things like young Earth creationism are just incoherent to the facts, so we shouldn't pursue them. So there is this separation between understanding what's coherent and what isn't, so that you do explore multiple pathways, but you don't explore dead ends. Right? So one thing the software does is to give you effectively measures of coherence. Because if I've got, for example, every 17-year-old in every school in South Wales capturing stories every week, I can statistically measure the patterns in that and say this is a dispositional state, an attitudinal state, which people will follow. So if I push something into that, it will get resonance and it will get picked up and taken on. I don't start with, I am the expert, I know what people need. I start with, this is where people are, how can I do a micro nudge to take them to the next step?
I think I'd like to add to that around your issue of kind of agency, subjectivity and objectivity. It's that very much what we're trying to do here is to make people subjects of the research rather than objects of the research. So it's not about treating people like lab rats and doing research to them. It's about actually engaging them in a process that everybody's an equal partner in and has mutual access to this knowledge resource from across diverse perspectives. On the point where you talk about kind of the cultural lenses, when somebody does a Sensemaker and they share their story, they write their self-interpretation, and then they see it in comparison to other people's, they might see, oh, well, actually, I tend to fit into this really common moderate mass that, you know, most other people seem to be in. Whereas, you know, there's somebody who clearly sees the world very different to me over here. Now, typically, and particularly as an issue with social media, you only ever interact with people similar to yourselves, or algorithms channel you down to similarity. What we're trying to do is to expose difference as a more generative kind of process in order to say, look, if somebody sees the world differently to how you do, there's probably something to be mutually learned here, and obviously respected in that as well.
One of the first big pilots projects we did was with Liverpool Slavery Museum. And that's worth going if anybody's in the UK. I mean, it's got a model of a slavehold. It's got a Ku Klux Klan robe, which terrifies me because you can see that somebody sat at home and stitched it. Yeah, you can see the hand stitching. So what we did there is we captured experiences of people. But then this is the meaning world concept. I can look at a body of stories and I can interpret those stories. Then I can see how the people who told them interpreted them, and I ask myself questions about the difference. And it's that multiple threaded interaction. So I want to see that exhibit from the background of somebody whose ancestors 4 generations ago were slaves, because they'll see it in a very different way from the way I see it. If you go to Cardiff Castle, right, which was built by the Butte, most people see it as a tourist attraction. My grandfather was head gamekeeper to the Butte. He had a heart attack. They threw the entire family on the street the day after he died. So I have a very different perspective on that. Yeah, from my mother's history than other people. So the ability to see how different people see the same data and ask yourselves questions without facilitation is actually quite important.
Yeah, it's somewhat a degree of kind of the ability to hold a mirror up to yourself almost through the lens of another. So to be able to see how somebody sees the world differently to how you see the world, you can start questioning, well, why is it that I see things this way? And what is it that my experiences have inherited that mean that I see the world this way?
One of the big visions we got on the next generation of the software is that a politician, for example, can entangle their own history with the history of the people who vote for them and see minor points of resonance and similarity so that they shift the way they think. So you break the sort of opinion polls, the direct questions, and you increase the intimacy of people's interaction. But you do that at scale, and I think intimacy is a key concept here. If you don't have that, people won't change anyway.
But again, this is like a technological tool, and there are examples of like different technologies and softwares like being used for purposes others than they've been intended for. So like, what are the risks of like using these kinds of tools in this like politically polarized, divided world? For example, like what kinds of responsibilities does it like give to the developers of these products to like mitigate the potential for like misuse or abuse of these tools?
Okay, she's pointed at me because this was originally developed in the concept of counterterrorism for DARPA programs in the States. So that's where we did the original work. Yeah. Now, the objective in that program was not to have bias built into the system. And we were a counter program to the AI-based, although I don't call it AI, it's machine learning. And one of the ways we developed was to develop Sensemaker to create more balanced training data sets for machine learning. Because if you look at the way those algorithms work, I mean, the classic case on this is Google, where they were only taking in male applications because their training data sets were from male managers. And I could give you lots of other examples. So by basically giving people the power to interpret their own data and giving people peer-to-peer access to that, we're not allowing somebody to control the training data sets or control access. And so you're managing that by going to a micro level, not a macro level. Yeah, and you're starting to determine, we know where the data came from rather than trying to work out whether the data is valid or not. If you can authenticate source, that's more better. Now, it's not perfect and it could be corrupted, but the mass level corruption you see in social media with AI algorithms at the moment, nobody's going to break that by better interpretation of data. We've got to find new and novel ways of generating data which is authentic to the people who tell it, and that's our focus.
Yeah. Well, so me and Aava were talking about like what we interpret like sense-making and complexity is, because like as I would assume we have very different interpretations of it. So we kind of wanted to like connect it back to the youth and our like Aava said, we're living in an increasingly more complex world. We're getting more globalized. We have more and more crises, like obviously the climate emergency, amongst other political problems as well. So I suppose like we just wanted to talk about what you mentioned earlier, actually, like echo chambers and social media. Because of the internet, we have access to a lot more information than like previous generations. Like it's literally on our fingertips. Like we have a little machine in the back pockets of our jeans. Like you're just able to basically find out anything in a split second. So do you think this is impacting our sense-making abilities, and how, given the situation and circumstances, should we be taught sense-making, so to say?
And actually, I hate to tell you, this is actually damaging cognitive functions. And if we look at the epigenetic aspects, your grandchildren will suffer from it, because we're becoming information-centric, not meaning-centric. So we got lots and lots of information, but we increasingly don't know how to make meaning from that. And therefore the algorithms make meaning for us or tell us what information we should pay attention to. And I think there's a whole body of knowledge. So for example, London taxi drivers is a classic example. Their hippocampus has to physically change shape before they can know that map of London. So there's a physical change needed, and it takes 2 or 3 years. Now, apprentice models of learning do the same thing. And apprentice models of learning give you judgment. When I was at school, we debated every week. You walked to the front of the class, you were given a card, it gave you a motion in which side you were on, and you had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation for something you might despise. We did that every week from 11 to 18. So what happened is the process built the ability to discriminate information into that generation. If all you receive is information, then people can control you more readily. So I think one of the things we need to find is to find new ways in which people can interact in combinations. We've been playing that with the trios method, which Beth's done work on. So how do you move people together in roles rather than focus on individuals?
Yeah, and I think for me is the importance of highlighting it being a social process, that any one person alone, your brain's going to get overwhelmed by this stuff. You're going to bring all of your own biases to it. It's how do you actually kind of weave people together almost in order to make that a much more social process that becomes builds empathy into it as well, so we don't become pure data processors.
There is a sort of Northern European, North American problem here, because those societies tend to see the individual as prime and really have seen the Reformation as society as an aggregation of individual interests, whereas Africa, Asia, the Celtic fringe see the collective as important and the individual gets meaning through that. So I think where the science is taking us is we need much more of that tribal, extended clan-like understanding and less focus on individual and individual desires, which is why I think there's a major problem with change programs which say if we change the individual, society will change. And the answer is it won't, because you can't do it at scale. But if you change the social interactions, people will change with those interactions. And I think that's the mission for your generation, is to change the way you interact across barriers and really start to see identity as collective, not individual. And that, this is what we talked about with JD and the guys. It's also the planet's part of that. You've got to interweave your own history with that of your environment as well as your people.
Yeah. So, like connecting it back to the youth, this is really like the core of what we wanted to talk about, actually. But just, what do you think the role of the youth would be in this idea of sense-making and complexity? And if you could give 3 pieces of advice about sense-making to a room full of young people, what would it be?
I think young people have a key role in both being participants and leaders in making this stuff happen. I think we should all be at the table being represented. But actually the role of young people is actually almost demanding or making this something that does happen. Because if I don't think the current generation are necessarily going to do that, they're far too comfortable. I think that's something for younger people to actually say, no, we're putting our foot down, this is how we want it to be done. In terms of what advice I would give, rule number 1 for me is always humility. You're never going to know all of the answers. Find yourself good people who might help you out. I would say, secondly, to be very, very aware of the biases that you've inherited from your culture, your experience to date. They do taint the way you see the world, and just to be very aware of how they do that. Third piece of advice, be very distrustful of social media.
I think 3 things. So one is, there's another book by Terry which is worth reading called Hope Without Optimism. So in Catholic theology, to abandon hope is a mortal sin. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to be optimistic. And that's the trouble. Too many people think if we get some people together in a workshop and we all agree the world will be different, it makes us feel good, but then nothing changes thereafter. Yeah, so be very cautious about that sort of optimism. I think the second thing is the connectivity, but also the connectivity across generations. There are actually reasons around brain plasticity why young people can actually do things with their grandparents that they can't do with their parents. So starting to create those connections, so use the networks of older people and their understanding together with inspiration and bright ideas. So create those sort of networks. And then I think the third thing is you have to be politically active. You have to recognize the current political constructs of society and you have to work them. You can't just say, I don't like this, so I don't want to be part of it, because then you're endorsing it. So you need to be activist. I mean, my famous joke on this is my family for 6 generations, every eldest child has been in a police cell for civil disobedience before they were 18. I managed it at 14, so I have the family record. You need more people doing that. You've got to be prepared to challenge things, to assert things, and you've got to engage with the process.
Thank you for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you for the questions and for having us.